Something was silently stealing the power from my prayers, and I didn't even know it. Every word I spoke in the spirit felt blocked, resisted, suffocated. Why did heaven feel distant when my mouth was full of prayers? What hidden rule was opening doors I never meant to unlock? I lived inside the occult long enough to see the truth most believers ignore. And what I discovered about intimacy will shake everything you thought was harmless. You thought it was only physical, only emotional, only a moment of pleasure, comfort, or connection. But in the spirit, something far deeper was taking place. Every act of intimacy creates a spiritual exchange, not a symbolic one, a real one, an invisible transaction that links souls, transfers burdens, and opens doors. When I was inside the occult, we understood this law very clearly. We did not see intimacy as romance. We saw it as a gateway, a ritual, a spiritual bridge between two lives. Because when two bodies come together, two spirits also touch. And spirits carry histories. They carry wounds. They carry covenants. They carry attachments. You may think you are only connecting with a person, but in the spirit, you are also connecting with everything attached to that person. Their past partners, their secret habits, their hidden struggles, their unbroken cycles, their spiritual debts. And if they carry darkness, that darkness looks for a new host. I remember rituals where intimacy was not even about pleasure. It was about transfer of power, transfer of control, transfer of spiritual influence. We were taught that intimacy could be used to weaken someone's spiritual defenses, to plant confusion, to create emotional dependency, to open their soul without them realizing it. And the most dangerous part, the person being affected often believed it was just love. But the spirit world never sees intimacy as just love. It sees covenant. Every act of intimacy writes a spiritual agreement, even if you never speak a word, even if you never intended it, even if it only happened once. Because the spirit does not operate on your intentions. It operates on spiritual laws. This is why some people notice a strange shift after certain relationships. Before the relationship, they were focused, disciplined, spiritually strong, peaceful. But after intimacy with the wrong person, everything changed. Suddenly, their prayer life feels dry. Their mind feels heavy. Temptations become stronger. Confusion increases. Peace disappears. And they don't understand why. They blame stress. They blame work. They blame life. But the truth is, a spiritual door was opened. Inside the occult, we knew the secret. And we used it strategically. We would study a person's weaknesses, their emotional wounds, their loneliness, their desire for affection. Then we would send someone into their life, not to love them, but to connect with them. Because once intimacy happened, a spiritual wall around that person would begin to crack. Their spiritual sensitivity would drop. Their discernment would weaken. Their prayers would lose authority, not because God abandoned them, but because they unknowingly opened a door. And doors are legal access points in the spirit. You cannot leave your front door open at night and be surprised when something enters. The spirit world works the same way. Many believers are crying out in prayer, asking why their voices feel unheard, why their spiritual authority feels weak, why they feel constantly attacked. But they never examine the spiritual doors connected to their intimacy. They never ask, who did I join myself to? What were they carrying? What doors did that union open? Because intimacy is not only a physical act. It is a spiritual agreement. And every agreement has consequences. This is why some people leave relationships feeling drained, confused, and spiritually distant. It was not just heartbreak. It was transfer. They received burdens that were never theirs, thought patterns that did not originate from them. struggles they never had before, and suddenly their prayer life feels blocked because the spiritual environment around them has changed. While I was still deep in the occult, we understood something most believers ignore. If we wanted to weaken someone's spiritual authority, we did not always attack them directly. We attacked their intimacy. We knew that if they formed the wrong connection, their own actions would open the door for us. And once that door would open, resistance became easier. Their prayers would feel heavy. Their spiritual fire would dim. Their confidence would shrink, all without them realizing the real cause. They would keep praying, but the spiritual interference remained, because the door that allowed it was never closed. This is the hidden intimacy rule many people violate without knowing. They think prayer alone fixes everything, but prayer cannot close a door you keep reopening. You cannot ask for spiritual protection while maintaining spiritual connections that invite darkness. The spirit world respects alignment. If your life is aligned with light, light responds. If your life is aligned with open doors, darkness responds. There is no neutral ground. And the painful truth is this: many of the spiritual battles people face today did not start with witches, did not start with curses, did not start with enemies. They started with a relationship, a connection, a moment of intimacy, a door quietly opening. And once it opened, everything began to shift. That is why some prayers feel powerful and others feel like they never leave the room. Because spiritual authority is not only about what you say, it is also about what doors are open in your life. And intimacy is one of the most powerful doors of all. You may call it a relationship, you may call it love, you may call it a private moment between two people. But in the spirit, intimacy is never private. It is witnessed, it is recorded, it is established as a covenant. And covenants carry authority. Inside the occult, we understood the power of covenants more than most believers do. We knew that words were powerful, but we also knew that actions could create agreements without a single sentence being spoken. Intimacy was one of the strongest ways to seal a spiritual bond, because when two people unite physically, their spirits recognize the connection. And the spirit world responds to that union as an agreement, not a temporary one, a binding one. This is why certain relationships leave marks that last for years, even after the person is gone, even after the phone number is deleted, even after the memories fade. Something still feels attached. Something still pulls at your emotions, your thoughts, your spiritual focus. That is not just nostalgia. That is the residue of a covenant. In the occult, we were taught to use intimacy as a tool of binding. If someone wanted influence over another person, intimacy was one of the fastest ways to establish it. Because intimacy lowers spiritual defenses. It creates emotional openness. It forms deep soul ties. And those ties become spiritual cords. Once those cords exist, influence becomes easier. Thoughts can be affected. Decisions can be swayed. Spiritual sensitivity can be clouded. And the person being affected often has no idea why their life feels different. They only know that after that relationship, something shifted. Their clarity faded. Their peace weakened. Their spiritual discipline dropped. But they never connected to intimacy, because they were never taught that intimacy is not only an act, it is a covenant. And covenants give access. In the spirit, access is everything. Darkness does not always break in. Sometimes it is invited. Not through rituals, not through spells, but through relationships. A single act of intimacy with the wrong person can create a spiritual bridge. And that bridge does not just connect two people. It connects two spiritual environments. If the person united with carried oppression, that oppression now has a pathway. If they carried addiction, that influence now has a pathway. If they carried spiritual darkness, that darkness now has a pathway. And suddenly, you are fighting battles you never had before. You begin struggling with thoughts that feel foreign, temptations that feel stronger than usual, emotional heaviness that has no clear cause. And your prayers start to feel weak, not because prayer lost its power, but because a covenant created spiritual interference. Inside the occult, we relied on this law. We knew that once a covenant was formed, it created legal access. And legal access meant we did not always have to fight someone directly. Their own spiritual connections would do the work for us. It was quieter, less obvious, but far more effective, because the person would never suspect the real source of their struggles. They would blame stress. They would blame work. They would blame their own weakness. But the truth was, they were carrying spiritual agreements they never meant to sign. Imagine signing a contract without reading it. Imagine placing your signature on a document you never understood. That is what many people do with intimacy. They enter the act thinking it is temporary, casual, private. But in the spirit, it becomes a contract. And contracts do not expire just because you feel different later. They remain active until they are broken. This is why some people cannot move on spiritually, no matter how much they pray, no matter how much they fast, no matter how much they try to start fresh, because they are still spiritually tied to someone from their past. A covenant still exists, and that covenant is affecting their spiritual authority. When I was still in the occult, we were taught something chilling. If you want to weaken a believer, connect them to the wrong person. You do not always need to attack them directly. You just need to influence who they join themselves to, because once the wrong covenant is formed, their spiritual strength begins to erode from the inside. Their prayers lose sharpness. Their discernment becomes dull. Their authority weakens. All because of a connection they believed was harmless. And the enemy understands this law very well. That is why so many people are drawn into relationships that look attractive on the surface but carry deep spiritual consequences underneath. It is not always about love. Sometimes it is about access. Access to your peace. Access to your focus. Access to your spiritual authority. And once that access is granted, the battle becomes harder, not because you are weak, but because you are spiritually entangled. This is the hidden intimacy rule many people break without realizing it. They pray for protection, but remain in covenants that invite interference. They ask for spiritual clarity, but stay connected to people who cloud their discernment. They cry out for breakthrough, but keep the spiritual contracts open. And until those covenants are addressed, their prayers will continue to feel resisted. Because in the spirit, authority flows from alignment, and intimacy creates alignment faster than almost anything else. At first, nothing seems wrong. You still pray. You still speak words of faith. You still go through your spiritual routine. On the outside, everything looks normal. But inside, something has shifted. Your prayers feel heavier. Your focus becomes scattered. Your spiritual hunger weakens. It is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow fading, like a fire that once burned brightly, now reduced to small, struggling embers. And you cannot explain why. You remember a time when your prayers felt alive, when your words carried authority, when you felt spiritually alert and strong. But after a certain relationship, after a certain moment of intimacy, everything changed. Not overnight, not in a dramatic way, just slowly. Your passion cooled, your discipline slipped, your clarity faded, and the most dangerous part is this: you do not even realize the connection. Inside the occult, we understood this process very well. We knew that the most effective spiritual attacks were not always loud or visible. The strongest attacks were silent, gradual, almost unnoticeable. Because when a person does not recognize the source of their weakness, they cannot fight it correctly. And intimacy was one of the quietest ways to create that weakness. When the wrong spiritual connection is formed, it does not always produce immediate chaos. Sometimes, it simply lowers your spiritual sensitivity. Your discernment becomes dull. Your convictions become softer. Your resistance to temptation becomes weaker. And slowly, your spiritual voice begins to lose strength. You still pray, but your words feel empty. You still worship, but your heart feels distracted. You still try to stand strong, but something keeps pulling you down. It is like speaking into a room where the sound keeps getting absorbed by the walls. No echo, no response, no movement, just silence. Many people think this is just spiritual dryness. They think it is a temporary emotional phase. But sometimes it is the result of a spiritual connection that disrupted their alignment. Inside the occult, we call this spiritual weakening through bonding. If someone was spiritually strong, disciplined, and hard to influence, we would not confront them directly. We would look for a relational opening, someone they trusted, someone they were attracted to, someone who could enter their life naturally. Because once intimacy occurred, their spiritual defenses would begin to lower, not because they were weak, but because a spiritual door had opened. And open doors change spiritual environments. After the wrong intimacy, a person might begin experiencing things they never struggled with before. Sudden emotional instability, unusual fears, compulsive thoughts, new temptations. They start asking themselves, why do I feel different? Why do my prayers feel powerless? Why am I struggling with things I never struggled with before? But they rarely trace it back to intimacy, because society teaches them that intimacy is just physical, just emotional, just personal. But the spirit world never sees it that way. In the spirit, intimacy is a point of agreement, and agreement determines authority. If your life is aligned with purity, your spiritual voice carries clarity. If your life becomes entangled with the wrong covenants, your voice becomes restricted. Not because heaven stopped listening, but because your spiritual alignment has shifted. It is like trying to send a signal through a damaged wire. The message is still there, but the connection is disrupted. Inside the occult, we depended on this disruption. Because once a believer's spiritual voice weakened, everything else became easier. Temptation became stronger. Discouragement became heavier. Confusion became normal. And the believer would begin to question themselves. They would say, maybe I am just not strong enough. Maybe my faith is not real. Maybe prayer does not work for me. But the truth was far deeper. Their spiritual voice had been entangled through the wrong intimacy. And until that connection was addressed, their authority would remain compromised. I remember seeing this happen over and over again. People who were once spiritually vibrant, reduced to confusion and heaviness. Not because they abandoned their faith, but because they unknowingly formed a spiritual bond that interfered with their alignment. And once alignment is disturbed, authority weakens. Your prayers are not just words. They are spiritual signals. And signals travel best through clean connections. But when intimacy forms the wrong covenant, it creates interference, static in the line, distortion in the signal, resistance in the flow. And suddenly, your spiritual voice feels silenced, not because you stopped praying, but because something is affecting the connection. This is why some people pray harder and harder, yet feel less and less spiritual movement, because effort alone cannot fix what alignment broke. And intimacy is one of the fastest ways to change alignment. It can either strengthen your spiritual life or slowly silence your voice. The moment you understand the spiritual impact of intimacy, everything begins to change. Because awareness breaks deception. And once deception is broken, restoration can begin. Many people think that once a spiritual door has been opened, it can never be closed. They carry guilt, shame, regret. They believe their past relationships have permanently damaged their spiritual life. But that is not the truth. In the spirit, doors may open through wrong intimacy, but they can also be closed through intentional separation and spiritual realignment. Inside the occult, we feared one thing more than anything else: a believer who became aware of spiritual laws and chose to realign their life with truth. Because awareness destroys hidden access. When a person recognizes the spiritual covenant formed through wrong intimacy, they gain the power to confront it. And confrontation leads to disconnection. Disconnection leads to freedom. But this process requires honesty. You cannot close a spiritual door you refuse to acknowledge. You must first examine the relationships that shaped your spiritual life, not with condemnation, not with shame, but with clarity. Ask yourself, who did I form deep intimacy with? What spiritual state were they in? What changed in my life after that connection? Did your peace disappear? Did your focus weaken? Did new struggles suddenly appear? These are not questions meant to accuse you. They are questions meant to reveal spiritual alignment. Because once alignment is revealed, correction becomes possible. Inside the occult, we avoided people who walked in spiritual clarity, because clarity meant closed doors. And closed doors meant no access. But when someone lived in confusion, emotional entanglement, and unexamined intimacy, their life became full of openings. And openings invite interference. The first step to reclaiming your spiritual authority is separation. Not always physical separation, but spiritual separation. You must break emotional dependence. You must release soul ties. You must refuse to maintain connections that keep spiritual doors open. This may feel painful. It may feel lonely. It may feel like loss. But sometimes separation is the doorway to restoration. You cannot keep spiritual doors closed while holding onto the very connections that opened them. Inside the occult, we relied on emotional attachments. Because even when a relationship ended physically, emotional ties often remained. And as long as those ties existed, the spiritual connection remained active. This is why some people still feel spiritually affected by relationships that ended years ago. Because the emotional and spiritual bond was never fully broken. They moved on physically, but not spiritually. And until that spiritual tie is released, the door remains slightly open. The second step to reclaiming your authority is spiritual cleansing, not in a ritualistic or occult way, but through realignment with light, through prayer that is honest and intentional, through a decision to live differently, through a conscious closing of every spiritual agreement that was formed in darkness. Inside the occult, we feared this kind of prayer. Not long, repetitive prayers, not emotional outbursts, but clear, intentional declarations that broke covenants. Because when a believer understood their authority and used it with clarity, spiritual contracts began to collapse. And when contracts collapse, access disappears. Darkness cannot remain where it has no legal ground. The third step is disciplined alignment. You cannot close a door today and reopen it tomorrow with the same behaviors. Spiritual authority grows where spiritual discipline lives. This means guarding your intimacy, guarding your emotions, guarding your connections, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Inside the occult, we studied patterns. And one of the patterns we saw repeatedly was this: People who guarded their intimacy carried strong spiritual authority. People who treated intimacy casually often carried spiritual heaviness. Because intimacy is not just about pleasure, it is about alignment. And alignment determines authority. When your life is aligned with purity, clarity, and intentional connection, your spiritual voice becomes stronger, your prayers carry weight, your discernment sharpens, your peace returns, not because of magic, not because of rituals, but because the spiritual doors that once allowed interference are now closed. And closed doors create protected spaces. Inside those protected spaces, your spiritual authority grows again. Your confidence returns. Your clarity strengthens. Your voice regains power. And suddenly, your prayers feel alive again. Not heavy, not resisted, not blocked, alive, because nothing is interfering with the connection anymore. This is the truth many people never hear. Your spiritual authority is not permanently lost because of past intimacy. It can be restored. Doors that were open can be closed. Covenants that were formed can be broken. Connections that drained you can be released. And once those doors close, your spiritual life begins to breathe again. The door that weakened you does not have to define you. You have the authority to close every connection that stole your spiritual strength. Your past intimacy does not control your future power. When you realign your life, your voice in the Spirit rises again. Your prayers regain fire. Your authority returns with force. And the doors that once invited darkness will never control you again.